We're so glad that you could join us today. Welcome to Beyond the KWL, Fostering Multiple Literacy Through KLEWS. I'm here today with my colleague, Rich Bacalor. I'll let Rich introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rich Bacalor, science consultant, former middle school teacher, and now obviously working with Wayne County RISA.
I'm Michelle Wagner. I'm a literacy consultant here at RISA, a former middle school teacher and elementary school teacher, and really glad to be a part of this today. And we are also joined by our colleague, Laura. Laura Gabrion is also a literacy consultant here at RISA, and she'll be manning the chat for us. So she'll be happy to answer any questions you might have and feed them to us. So please take advantage of that question and answer tab, as well as the chat function. So if you wouldn't mind just taking a moment to introduce yourself within the chat, you'll notice that the default for our Zoom webinar is that you will be responding just to the panelists. So feel free to change that to include all of the participants in the meeting so that you can share your ideas with them throughout our session today. As we consider, this whole summer learning blitz has really been about thinking about what we need to do in the fall. And since we don't really know, even now, what the fall might look like, whether that's remote or in person, the one piece that we do know is that regardless of whether we are in person or remote, we have to focus on those teaching strategies, those essentials that we know work. And if we do that, it won't matter so much where we are because we'll be focusing on what we're doing, which is so important.
So as we were putting together this presentation, we just wanted to put together a few of the key resources, the literacy essentials documents, really there's the K3 and then the 4-5 as well. And from the science aspect, a lot of what we're talking about today came from the STEM teaching tools, a great resource full of 1 to 2 page FAQ style resources to answer specific questions around the next gen science standards. And then of course we're updating the KWL to KLEWS, and so a lot of this comes from Carla Zembel-Saul's work around the update to KWL, which is called the KLEWS Chart. So a couple main questions that we thought are particularly important at this point. And you'll see they're sort of in a why, how, what format. And those questions are going to be sort of the guiding questions that we'll take through here. And the first one really is about multiple literacies approach. And we know, especially in the current situation, the time that we have is super valuable, right? We're face-to-face time is one thing, but in multiple ways, our time with our kids is changing and much more limited. So we really need to take a multiple literacies approach to make sure that we're essentially taking the best use of our time. And then the other two questions are really, how does the KLEWS chart help us do that, right? It's easy to talk about literacy integration, but without supports and tools for both the kids and the teachers to do that, we find that kind of integration, while possible, doesn't happen as frequently as we would like. So we'll look at the KLEWS chart as a sort of a strategy and a tool to help support that multiple literacies approach. Now, let's start with a little bit of bad news. So West Ed is an organization that does some professional learning and some development, and they surveyed roughly 400 middle school teachers about their experiences this spring. And one of the things that they found, and this is particularly important to remember, that these are middle school teachers, 88% of those teachers reported spending less time. And so when we talk about multiple literacies, it's really important to think that time is significantly less for science instruction. We have to make the best use of that time. Another finding that came out of that study was, what did teachers rely on when they went to teach science during the spring? And you can see from this list that up at the top are things like watching videos or simulations or simply reading about science. And while those things are important, we know from best practice in terms of science instruction that can't be the only thing that kids are doing, or it shouldn't be the only thing that we're doing. And we would argue that something like a KLEWS chart helps us balance that list of activities in a more productive way for both science and for literacy as well. So that's sort of the bad news. And one more bad news slide, which is everyone's overwhelmed, right? We have so many tools that are being thrown at us, from LMSs to different platforms that we're being asked to use. And so it can be very, very overwhelming. And what Michelle said earlier, I think is a really important point, and that is that we have to stick to what we know works the best, right? It's more about the pedagogy and less about the tool that we're using. And so if we can focus in on some of those key practices that students and teachers can engage in, then they can use multiple platforms in order to do that. So let's start with a little example of what we mean by multiple literacies. And so I want you to take a minute to just watch a short video, and in the chat, put down or type in, what do you notice about the student and what do you wonder, okay? So if you're ready to do that, and Laura will monitor the chat and give us some of your responses in a minute. Quick little warning, cuteness overload may occur.
Explosion. It killed most of the dinosaurs.
Was that a good thing or a bad thing?
A bad thing.
Oh, goodness.
It was real bad. Scientists also believe after that, it created a big cloud of dust. Without sunlight, it blocks the sun for months. But without sunlight, the plants died.
Oh, no.
So the dinosaurs that ate plants, they died.
Mm-hmm. And then once the dinosaurs that ate plants died, then what happened?
All the meat for the carnivores, they died, and then the carnivores died.
Oh, wow. That's really bad, huh?
Right.
Okay, so take a minute. What do you notice about the interaction with the child, and also what questions do you have?
We have one participant who's wondered who is reading to the child about dinosaurs, and noticing that the mom is prompting further thinking, large vocabulary on the part of the child. A wonder about the types of resources the mom and dad have shared to help the child learn all of this.
Excellent question. Yeah. So I would say that one of the things that is people are picking up on is that it's not just a single event, right? You see that there was a book at the beginning. There's some discussion with the caregiver, presumably the parent. There are toys in the background that are also dinosaur related, and obviously the child's shirt indicates a really big interest and motivation in learning this stuff. But I also want to point out that somebody mentioned the vocabulary here, is that this child really wasn't just talking about dinosaurs. There were food chains being talked about. There was a cloud of dust. There was some materials science being discussed. And so one of the things that it's really important as we think about multiple literacies is that science isn't just a topic like dinosaurs. Science is a series of relationships and explanations that children can develop even at very young age. They come with the ability to think very rationally about some very deep scientific ideas and processes. And let's look at that, as we kind of go through the rest of this presentation, let's think about how the KLEWS chart can help facilitate some of those cycles of activity that help this child develop such a a deep understanding at such a young age. One more quick little video. This comes from Dr. Brian Brown out of Stanford and his work in Science in the City. And culturally relevant STEM instruction is a really big topic right now, as it should be. And one of the things that kind of builds off of the young child, the young paleontologist, let's call her, is this idea of identity and language. And Dr. Brown is going to talk a little bit about that because I think it really gets into some of why we have to structure the cycles of activity a little bit differently than we may have in the past.
The subtext of my research is that language and identity are deeply connected. So when we communicate, anytime I communicate, I'm sending two messages. It's the content and who you understand me to be, or who I want you to understand me to be. And why that's a problem is that in urban contexts, particularly in urban schools and in science classrooms, is the teachers have an expectation for the students, and the students also have an expectation of themselves. And for students, it's difficult sometimes to sound scientific and feel comfortable. Conversely, for teachers, they expect these 15 and 16-year-old kids to sound like scientists, which is very unreasonable. And so the nature of the way we talk in classrooms is we play what my colleague, Dr. Jean Lithcott, calls a game of guess what's in my head. So we ask scientific questions, we ask students to answer them, and then everyone loses in the end, right? So the idea that's fundamental is that a lot of what students know and are really, really clear about is communicated in non-scientific language. And we need to prepare teachers to really understand that there are these rich parallels between the way that students understand ideas and the way that they can communicate them in both science and non-scientific language practices. And so the heart of my research is to study that idea. And there's two problems.
And that's kind of what Dr. Brown is talking about, brings us back to the literacy essentials. So I'm going to ask Michelle to take a stab at connecting those dots for us a little bit.
Sure. So when we think about the literacy essentials, we know that they are sound literacy practices that we believe should be implemented in every classroom every day. And specifically, when we're talking about pre-K through 6th grade, we're talking about the classroom as a whole, not just that ELA block. These are practices that should transcend throughout the school day. And for that to happen, that means we have to be teaching literacy even when we're teaching science. So there's no clear-cut first period, second period, but rather we cover all of these things throughout the day. And when we look at essential number 1, this idea of motivating and engaging students across lessons, one of the key ways we need to do that is by answering their questions about the natural world. And that's science in a nutshell. And so when we think about this, one of the videos that I like to lean into quite a bit is this idea of Dr. Nell Duke shares her perspective on the importance of not just science, but social studies as well, because I feel like there's so often this trend maybe to just focus on literacy and math because we're trying to just focus on these two core tested pieces. But we're doing our students a huge disservice if we don't include science and social studies, because science and social studies that really build their background knowledge and make them more literate. So I just, as Rich shares this, I want to focus and say how important it is not to leave off the science and the social studies instruction, because for some kids, that's the highlight of their day, and for all kids, that provides the background knowledge that they need. How's that, Rich?
That's wonderful. Couldn't have said it better. So again, we're just going to watch a little clip. The full video, I highly recommend it. It's about 30 minutes long, and she makes a really excellent case. So let's listen to what she has to say.
To science learning. We can assume that if less curricular time is devoted to science in the elementary grades, kids are going to have lower science achievement than they would. And in fact, there is some data from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, for example, that sees a relationship between the amount of time that's reported to be spent on science education and students' science achievement. We can make the same assumption about social studies. Kids will leave elementary school in the U.S. knowing less about social studies, having fewer social studies process skills if they have spent their elementary career almost exclusively on English language arts and math to the exclusion of science and social studies. But I'm arguing that this decline of attention to science and social studies is also detrimental to literacy learning. That is, that literacy actually requires, in the long term, strong understanding, knowledge of the world, it requires students to know the things that authors assume they know. And so if we don't have that in place, we don't have all that vocabulary knowledge that goes with it in that place, if we haven't developed students' ability to read and write inside science and social studies disciplines, then we're actually going to have long-term pay.
Right. So again, the argument that we don't hear this very often, that neglecting social studies and science is actually detrimental to literacy. And the catch-22 in that is that we can't really read about science or solely read about science in order to build background knowledge, because those two things are, as she said, very interconnected. And she goes on to use a great little, not great little, it's a research study that really brought this idea home for me. So again, we're going to do a little waterfall chat. What I'd like you to do is read this passage, and in the chat, tell me what it's about. Let's take another 10 seconds or so. What do you think that short paragraph is about? Or do we have any guesses?
The responses so far are, I have no idea, I'm clueless, cricket, scores, Romans, sports.
Well, we have a gold star answer in there somewhere. So whoever put cricket is absolutely correct. I had no idea the first time I read this, and most of us aren't, because although we can pronounce all of the words, and in fact, out of context, we can define most of these words in some way. I'm a grown man, been around for 50 years, and I had no idea that this paragraph was about cricket until somebody actually told me. And that's the problem with reading about science solely, right? If I don't have the background knowledge, then the meaning is lost. The person who wrote this intends for me to make inferences that I simply cannot make. And so, again, I think it's a nice way to think about, why do we need to be able to use multiple literacies to read and engage with text? And I first did this presentation about 2 years ago, and here these were some of the headlines. And I would argue that in some ways we talk about citizen science, but it might be more important for us now to change that terminology to talk about community science, because of course these were all issues that our communities needed to come around and have a certain amount of science literacy in order to engage with the text, make meaning of the text, and then actually take action in our lives. We're all deeply, deeply impacted by this now, and we know. So can we think about science literacy as more than just a group of facts, but something that impacts our daily lives, and something that we're going to need to use multiple literacies in order to understand and make good choices across the board?
Rich, as you're sharing this, I can't help but think about how we so often encourage our students to share their stories and to write narratives and pieces, and how science, especially right now in 2020, is so intertwined with all of our personal stories that it seems like this year, above all others, it's going to be important to weave science into everything that we do, because it's the story that we all have to share. It's
really a great point, Michelle. And so I think, one of the things that leads us to ask is, well, okay, so how? And fortunately, the literacy essentials line up very nicely with the new science standards as well, because that motivation and engagement really is asking us to see science in our everyday lives. So one great book around that, especially for folks who haven't had a whole lot of training in the next gen science standards, is Sharing Books and Talking Science. The book takes you through one aspect of the next gen science standards, which are the cross-cutting concepts. And I've listed them here because they're lenses, so to speak, to help us see science everywhere we look. And those things can be applied no matter what the content area is. And in fact, many pieces of literature deal in these same themes. So systems, patterns, energy and matter, cause and effect, scale, proportion and quantity, structure and function, and stability and change are all big ideas that are baked into our new science standards. So if you have one takeaway from today's presentation, start looking for cross-cutting concepts anywhere across the curriculum, across the day. And that can happen in both fiction and nonfiction texts, depending on what you're looking at. But that would be one easy way to start integrating a little bit more science into your literacy work, or seeing multiple literacies in our science work. Another piece, those of you that have been through a little bit more NGSS training are probably familiar with, is this is from the Michigan Science Standards Guidance for Principals. And this is what science should look like using the new standards. And so you can see on the left-hand side of the page, science education will look less like worksheets, less like the teacher standing and delivering lectures. And it will look more like using multiple engagement points, such as phenomenon. It will be using students designing and developing models or their own investigations. Now you can also see that in the current situation that we're in, this was a challenge before, and it's even more challenging now. And that's one of the reasons why we're presenting the KLEWS chart as a way to bring in some more of this right-hand side, no matter what the format or the platform that we're having to use. Another way to put that is that whatever activities we're designing or planning for with our students around literacy and science, we want to focus on having them figure something out, right? There's a shift that is talked about in both of these pieces, and that is learning about or simply reading about a topic doesn't really engage the motivation and engagement on the level of figuring out, right? And so Tanya Wright is another literacy expert, and she's worked with Amelia Gottwall as a science expert to come up with some K2 lessons that we have a link for later. But it's really about giving kids multiple opportunities to use multiple literacies, and so that the activities that they're using or that they're engaged with aren't simply disconnected videos or disconnected readings, but that they're developing these deep understandings, just like our young paleontologists, over a period of time, right? Not one book didn't suffice to have that child learn as much as she did about dinosaurs and the plot of what ended up happening with the extinction of the dinosaurs. It took multiple varied activities and long-term engagement. So what does that mean? Well, from a science standpoint, the instruction really breaks down to 4 big parts, and Dr. Catherine McNeil from Boston College puts them this way. We have to start instruction with a phenomenon. There should be an engaging problem or question that is driving the instruction. Second, we need to make sure that students are collecting data and using evidence, and that includes text evidence, but also includes collecting and developing investigations that produce their own data, right? We want to make sure that kids, true scientific thinkers, aren't just consuming data that is produced by others. They're actually producing their own data, and they're arguing about that data. And that's where productive discourse comes into play. I think you can probably see many opportunities in your daily lives right now where productive discourse would be a benefit not only to our younger kids, but to adults as well. And as we saw earlier, the vocabulary has to be developed just in time, right? So as opposed to setting up a word wall ahead of time with a bunch of words that could be in any language for our younger learners, we want to make sure that they're connecting that to the experience or to the concept that they're already using and the resources that they're already bringing to the table, because they are bringing quite a bit of understanding with them. And our job as science instructors is to just add the vocabulary towards the end, right? Give them the shorthand or invite them to use the words that scientists use as well. And Michelle, I don't know if you want to say anything else about vocabulary in that moment.
No, I'm struck by even the words that are being used here as we think about sense making. Those are literacy concepts and literacy ideas. So it's just another reminder of how cross-curricular this really is, this idea of collecting information and using evidence to support our claims and then having that productive discourse. It all ties in so nicely. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so a lot of us have been through some formative assessment training or some assessment work, and two words kind of jump out to me during those trainings, and we often talk about assessment of learning or assessment for learning. And I'm stealing that terminology here because a lot of times what we end up seeing, and especially now going back to the West Ed data, is that we're asking students to consume science, right? So they're doing a lot of reading or writing or listening of science topics. But the shift that we want to make, and one of the things that the KLEWS chart kind of helps us do, is put the students in more of an active space to construct knowledge. And so they're reading, they're writing, they're speaking and listening. They're using those literacy skills for the service of science, to develop a science explanation or to develop a model that really uses all of the ideas that are important and that we put into the standards. So that key knowledge, they're actually applying it throughout that process. But again, it takes more than just reading about or watching a video to develop those kind of ideas. All right. Visually, we might look at it like this. Again, from Dr. McNeil at Boston College. We use the see, think, wonder, especially with our younger kids. When we present the problem, when we present the phenomenon to them, there's an equity piece because I'm not asking them to just read about it or think about something that the whole class hasn't had a chance to or access to. We're presenting something in the natural world for them to see all together, to think about, and to wonder about. And then the cycle of activity goes into investigating, making sense of the data, constructing an initial model, and then our critiquing aspect of that goes back to what did we learn? What does it all mean? And do we have to adjust? Again, science is not as neat as the scientific method would have had us believe. Most of us went through that kind of training when we were kids. And real science doesn't actually work in such a neat linear fashion. It's more of a cycle of asking questions, gathering data, and then making sense of that data. And again, that's where the literacy practices of speaking and listening lead us into making sense of reading and writing. Another way of looking at that, and we're going to get to the KLEWS chart in just a second, but another way of thinking of that, or another model of that, is that science activity can be broken down by the practices into times when we're gathering information, when we're reasoning about the information that we've gathered, and then we're communicating about it as well. So again, two models for the same idea, but it gets away from this idea that science, I actually saw this in a first grade online lesson, said science always starts with a hypothesis. And if we're kind of using that scientific method idea as opposed to start with a question and then use the multiple literacies and the multiple practices to find an answer or work your way towards an answer, we get kids the better or more complete idea that science isn't always as neat and tidy as a linear one single method. Okay, so that leads us to the KLEWS chart. And this is, again, work that was developed primarily by Carla Zembel-Saul out of Penn State University. Locally, she worked very closely with Mary Starr from the Michigan Math and Science Center network. And so here's the format that they came up with and that we've been using with a lot of success around Wayne County, and that is the KLEWS chart. So you can see from the update that the KWL was what do we know, what do we want to know, and then what did we learn? And the update to that, I think, it is nice because it's not just science, really. You could apply the KLEWS chart to more than science, but it puts kids in a much more active role by by asking 5 basic questions. And that first question is, what do we think we know? Right? That prior knowledge piece, using your own language to describe what is happening with the phenomenon is really important. And then the middle 2 pieces, we might be familiar with claim, evidence, and reasoning from some of our other work. And those 2 columns really are not set in stone, but in flux, right? So what claims can we make right now? And importantly, especially from the science aspect, what evidence do we have to say that, right? What evidence supports the claims that we're making? And then, of course, science really should start at all levels with a wondering or a question. And that's tied into this, this bigger picture at the top, which is, what is our question? What is our big phenomena or anchor? What is the problem that we're trying to solve? And so I'm going to take you guys through an example, and then, sorry, in the last column we have the science words. So we do need to develop vocabulary, right? We want to keep track of that, but notice that it comes towards the end, right? Because if I can make some observations and claims and evidence, that's going to give me, as an instructor, a pretty good idea of what concepts the kids are holding. And once that happens, then I can add to that the vocabulary that will help students go on and talk about things really in shorthand. So here's an example of what one might look like. In this particular example, we took 4th graders and we put some hot water in a 2-liter bottle. We closed that 2-liter bottle and we sat it on the table. That's all we did. And if anybody's familiar with that kind of a little experiment, the bottle collapses, right? So at the bottom you can see where we took sticky notes and we took all of the student questions that they had about that and we put them in categories in the wondering column, okay? From there, we went through a series of investigations. Some of them included hands-on materials, some of them included reading or videos or simulations. And from there, we collected evidence that would help us answer those questions. And then you can see the vocabulary. So obviously in a classroom setting, that's a little bit easier or a little bit different to look at. So what would that look like in a space where we couldn't do all of the hands-on lessons? Well, I have an example here that I'll walk through quickly, and then we'll also have some time towards the end for some more questions. But this comes from the Phenomenal Science unit. I believe this is the 5th grade, Go with the Flow, Earth Systems. And I just want to show you how some of these, if we use the KLEWS chart as our foundation or as our to help us structure the activities, even in an online space, we can still engage students in these important sort of constructivist ways of using multiple literacies. So in this particular unit, the kickoff is students are exposed to the idea that zebra mussels have come into the Great Lakes and could be impacting the water and the land and the people. So that's the driving question. And from there, they watch a video, a short video clip, and they're asked in the video clip, what do you see, what do you think, what do you wonder? Okay, again, nothing really hands-on about that. It is just watching a video, but that's the first part. So the first cycle is watching the video and then making some observations about the video and then wonderings. Another round of See, Think, Wonder happens with this. Now this happens to be an online data visualization, kind of a GIS map of where we find and how many places we find invasive zebra mussels. These particular time frame, this is a short video. You click the button and it takes you year by year through the data. So I won't do that here, but again, students are looking at patterns, they're thinking about what's occurring, and then they're encouraged to ask questions, right? And that's the engagement piece. That's the motivational piece that we're wanting kids to feel and sense and see, so that then they're motivated to drive into some further engagement with text and with gathering evidence. So here's another reading. This comes straight from the materials. They just pulled this out of Wikipedia. But here we have the questions are wondering, our notices and wondering so far. And so now kids are asked to go back and look for claims and evidence, right? And this is where we pick up some of that vocabulary because they've already had an experience with zebra mussels and they've already done some looking at patterns. This text is much more accessible to a wider range of students.
Rich, it really seems like that kind of is different from the way in which science instruction was done for so long. I think back to my own classroom experience, and so often we would do definitions and vocabulary at the beginning of the unit, and this almost has students understanding science in their own words before they even learn the scientific term. Is that correct?
Absolutely, absolutely correct. Now, as a middle school science teacher, you know, that this flip to doing things that way was a really big ask for me at the beginning, right? Again, my own experience was a march through the chapter, learn the vocabulary, do the sample problems, and then on really good days, you know, my teacher would give me a lab, a hands-on lab that would confirm that the textbook or the teacher's lecture was telling me the truth, right? And so, Michelle, you're absolutely right. This flips that around because in that sense, in the way that I went through middle school science, I wasn't being asked to think like a scientist or act like a scientist. I was asked to believe the authority person in front of the room who knew the right answers. And like Dr. Brown talked about, there was a game of guess what's in my head, right? So the teacher would present information, I would digest that information and then spit back what I remembered from it. That's not really how people develop scientific practices. That's not really how science works. And so this is an attempt, in a way, to flip that narrative. And I would argue that that's not only better for their science instruction, but it's also better for their literacy because engaging in that problem at the beginning and being able to explain things in my own words then leads me to that cognitive dissonance where I'm going to search for more evidence and maybe struggle through a text that I'm not 100% sure I can because I'm looking for something specific. I'm looking for something that's going to help me answer my question. And so you're right, it's a complete flip, and that's really hard face-to-face, and it may be even harder you know, in the current situation. But hopefully the KLEWS chart, if we use that to sort of, again, structure the cycle of activity that we're using with our students, I think we're going to give them a better face-to-face experience, but we're also going to give them a better online or blended experience as well. So going sort of just back through a couple more pieces of this lesson sequence. So students, here's a simulation of a lab that they would do, right? So students watch what the effects are and model using some very basic materials. They're essentially using at-home materials like coffee filters and straws and things like that to create a simulation of the zebra mussel and see if what they've created also filters the water. Again, the conclusions for this, the modeling and the investigation, then go back to our KLEWS chart and are added to the claims and evidence pieces, right? So that we're building understanding over time, and we're still focusing, again, not on this topic of what is a zebra mussel, but how does zebra mussels impact the Great Lakes? And this investigation kind of helps us answer that question. So that's why we do it. And then this one I think is very, I really like this lesson as well. They look at different light levels as it passes through the water. Again, you can do this in a demo, you can do this in a simulation. Ideally, kids would do this hands-on, but it helps build that idea of cause and effect, right? So what does changing the way that light passes through the water have to do with the zebra mussels and the impacts that we see later? Well, we look at that, right? And again, if you go back to our young paleontologist, she was talking about very similar ideas in another context. So if we had that paleontologist lesson around the dinosaurs, and then we're applying this same kind of idea, how does light interact with the atmosphere or the water, we're developing some really, really important and big ideas throughout the curriculum, right? And so then lastly, we come back. Every time we cycle through, we come back to the KLEWS chart, add more evidence to our site. We may have to change a claim if we find conflicting evidence, and that's just how science works. But this is the cycle of activity. And then we might read some more, right, to get to the cause and effect, to get to our final explanation. Where there are holes in our understanding, we might need to go back and do some more investigation and see what other people have figured out as well.
I'm noticing that you have 2 articles there from Newsella, and I know that Newsella was a free resource over in the spring. But where might you recommend that teachers find resources about science now, texts that they might read?
Yeah, Newsella is a great resource. I think the important part to me is not necessarily where you find the reading material, because again, you're going to need material that is grade appropriate, maybe pushing the ZPD a little bit higher. But the key part is that in this particular unit, these readings were picked specifically because there was evidence in here that would help the kids support their main argument at the beginning, right? So it's not enough just to pick science articles for the sake of picking science articles. Scientists don't actually read like that when they're looking for, or they're engaged in a specific pursuit of a problem, right? They're going to look for text evidence that supports or refutes what they're seeing in their own investigations, and that's what these are. That's what these were chosen for. So I would never, ever, ever say, don't just read science, of course. But when we're designing the lessons, or when we're trying to engage students in this cycle of activity, we want to make sure that the readings are done extremely purposefully, right? So that they're going to find some clue in this reading that helps support their answers at the end. And we can see that as we get towards the end and we want students to write about their experience, or we want them to communicate, what did you actually learn, right? So that requires multiple practices, and it can take multiple forms. So again, going back to my own experience, the end of every single science lesson was write your science report. And that's, again, where we went back to what was your question, what was your hypothesis, what was your method. So those types of writings are very specific, but that's not the only way that scientists write, and that's not the only reason why scientists write. So when we use the KLEWS chart, we can see that we're actually building a scaffold for kids to write multiple pieces, right? And here, this is actual 5th grade student work from one of the teachers that we were working with. Again, this was back in the face-to-face days, so this was part of her science notebook, but she has a model at the top, right? And you can see drawings, text features, labels, and then she wrote a piece, not even that very long, but it explains how the zebra mussels were affecting the water in her area. So
looking at that, sorry,
yeah.
as you're sharing that, that is exactly something that we want our students to do, because what she has created mimics what authors actually write. Very rarely do I pick up from a library shelf a book that looks like a science report that I would have written in 5th grade. But I do pick up texts that look just like what this child has created, with the diagram and the description and the labels. And I feel like that's so empowering to a child, as we try so desperately to make them see themselves as authors. This is a student who's already seeing herself as an author and creating nonfiction text.
Yeah, and again, what you see in this particular text is specific. Like, this is not just a kid copying a diagram that she saw out of the notebook or out of a textbook. This is her really putting together the pieces of information that she gathered with her classmates in a social context on the KLEWS chart, using the structure to come up with a pretty impressive piece of writing. And so I would say, like, again, the KLEWS chart is not the be-all, end-all, but it does help and support this kind of work in a wide range of students, right? So Can the clues chart be transferred into multiple contexts? I would argue, yes, it can. And I'm going to turn this over just a bit to Michelle for some help on the digital side of things.
Sure. So we've just tried really hard to help you think about what this might look like in the digital world. And so this is just a digital version of the clues chart. It's a Google Slides template that Laura's throwing into the chat right now. And it's nothing spectacular. It just lets you have your students add Post-it notes with ideas right into the chart so that you don't have to create anything on your own. So it's just an easy way that you can use that. We also have a Jamboard version of that same clues chart where it works in pretty much the same exact way, where students can add their questions right to the chart digitally. The one caution with Jamboard is that Jamboard, while it is part of your G Suite app, it only allows 50 students to interact with the chart at any time. So once you have 50 people view that, it stops working. So just wanted to let you know about that. And then finally, and this is going back to my elementary teacher roots, if you're thinking, how can I put this up in my classroom and use this in a way that not only is effective, but also looks cute? Here we go. Here's a sample bulletin board where you can download the pieces and put it up in your own classroom when we do go back face-to-face. So if that's something that's of use to you, we're providing a printable version of that for you as well.
That's great. And, you know, we used a 5th grade example to sort of shoot for the middle a little bit, but I've seen clues charts work amazingly with kindergarten students, with all the way up through high school, but primarily that K-8 is a really sweet spot for using that kind of format. And again, I think the argument that we're making here is the clues chart is a nice tool to help us engage students in that motivating engagement around phenomenon and wonder and exploring their world using the science standards, or the 3 dimensions of our science standards, the practices, the cross-cutting concepts, and important core ideas that leads them towards using multiple literacies and writing and reading in a variety of ways. So I know we've got a couple more minutes here. I did want to put in links to some free resources. I know, again, we sort of started with the idea that there was resource overload and we can't deal with more resources. But if you're interested in implementing the clues chart, you know, obviously you can do this on your own, but another way I would strongly recommend is to look at some lessons that are already set up and adapt them to your own context, especially now as we're trying to learn things like Schoology, or we're learning some new G Suite tools or Canvas and things like that. I think it's a lot easier for us to take something and adapt it to those systems as opposed to trying to create this from zero. So again, Mary Starr, I mentioned her earlier, has put together some really nice K-5 lessons with sample clues charts already made up, and the link is right there in those slides, with remote adaptations. There are some other lessons sort of around singular Ps on the Going 3D site, and that's the Gather, Reason, Communicate folks. Brett Molding's the researcher there. Solid Start K2, we just had a series of intro webinars last week with Tanya Wright, Amelia Gottwals, and Amber Bismack from MSU, and they've also put together these full K2 units called Solid Start. There's a link there. Love to get more people involved with those. If you're interested, you can check out that webinar, and we can also kind of help you, support you with those. But those are also set up to be used directly with a clues chart or some other type of framework like that. And then lastly, the Phenomenal Science unit. There's a whole series of those K5, and that's where the zebra mussel lessons came from. So there's a link to our Atlas Rubicon where you can find the rest of those units. Again, nothing, I want to stress that, like, we can't recreate science instruction completely in a virtual space. It just has to be done. You know, certain aspects of this have to be done face to face because science is a social activity. But as we work through the fall and into this coming year, we would encourage you guys to use the clues chart, try it out, and see what works in some of these other arrangements that we're forced to use right now. Some other links that were used for the resources or in the development. Again, if you have any questions about these, feel free to contact me. And then one last little parting idea from the science guy is that really student ideas are the raw material. This comes from Larkin's work with diverse classrooms. And I think as a science teacher, understanding that real science is messy is very important. And we see that in practice today as we try and figure out really the path forward from the coronavirus. Science is not always super easy, super neat, and super linear. But if we take, as teachers of our youngest students, and start engaging them in some of this messy work and giving over the control for them to figure out things that are obviously less dangerous than the coronavirus, then perhaps we make some long-term gains in both literacy, both science, and then we create a culture of problem solvers that we don't have currently. And so that's my hope, that your classroom has the spirit of inquiry, and that helps everybody in the community.
You know, as I think about what you've shared today, Rich, one of the key takeaways for me is that when I think back to the KWL chart, when I would do the KWL chart, there was a definite end point. Once we wrote down what we learned from the text, you know, that anchor chart was gone. It was not something that stayed around in my classroom and hung out. But I'm seeing this KLEWS chart as being something that I could come back to long after the unit is over, as we continue to learn and investigate and study. Is that correct? Do you see teachers going back to this throughout the year?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, there was an upper L teacher, a 5th grade teacher who did a series of KLEWS charts with her classroom. And most of these were built around a class model, right? So there was individual work, but they were working towards the class model, and each KLEWS chart and each model was then posted around the classroom for students. And what she found was that the students really transferred the science knowledge from unit to unit more so than they had ever done before, because they could see those pieces. And it was a really easy way for the teacher to say, well, what did we figure out when we were studying the zebra mussels, right? And then the students had that sort of look back at their own work, and they were using their own work as references for their new work. And that's really what real scientists actually do. So yeah, absolutely.
Well, not even just real scientists, too. Real writers do that as well, as we continue to grow in our experience and we keep drawing in those new learnings into what we're currently working on. I just see the connections all over the place. And as those questions might be populated, we do want to encourage you to take some time and just give us a little feedback so that we can continue to offer these types of sessions for you and to do it in a way that better meets your needs. So if you are with us live, Laura has put a link in the chat to the feedback form. And if you are joining us via video after this webinar is long past, we would encourage you just to go to tinyurl.com/Blitz RESA or use that QR code just to give us some feedback. We're always trying to learn and grow, and we want to serve you better. So whatever information you can give us will certainly help us do that. So we appreciate you taking the time to share with us. And then we also want to encourage you to connect with us. We are here to help you. That's why Wayne RESA exists, is to help educators and to serve and support you in whatever ways you might need. And one of our favorite people in the world is Mr. Rogers. And Mr. Rogers said in any situation, especially those scary situations, you should look for the helpers. And hopefully we can be the helpers in this situation. We don't have all of the answers, but we are certainly happy to investigate and learn alongside of you and to be here to support you however you might need. So feel free to connect with us however you might choose, whether that's by email or through Twitter. We're here for you.